This month, there's something very different about my project. It's not my usual type of thing at all, probably because it's entirely based on images of the upper class. More specifically, it's inspired by the dress worn by Mary of Hungary at her wedding to Louis II, though I wasn't setting out to make a totally accurate interpretation of this garment whatsoever. But, while working on this project, and complaining to my friends about the massive amount of silk and hem I've been drowning under for the past 3 weeks, I've come to realize that I should probably talk about why I don't usually do upper-class impressions, and why you likely won't see me pull this monstrosity out for anything beyond special occasions. You see, there are practical reasons for this, and then there are the far more important reasons of history. When it comes to practicality, it is mostly a finances thing. This garment took a total of 8 yards of silk for the fashion fabric, and then was lined in about 7 yards of various wools and linens that I had in my stash, since in order to fall correctly, the skirt had to be fully lined. Compare that to the 4 yards of fashion fabric and 2 yards of lining on my similar lower-class German Renaissance gown, and it's simply more practical for me, a poor college student, to spend my money on that level of impression so I could have a better quality impression as a whole. After all, the accessories are what really help to round out a look. There's also the aspect of personal taste. I mentioned in a couple of live streams during Cozy that part of the reason I avoid polyester is because it's a little bit of sensory hell for me. And in working with the silk taffeta and satin I turned into the guards, I realized that silk also hits those bad material bits of my brain. It's too loud, and I don't particularly like the way it feels in my hands. There are plenty of upper-class garments that aren't silk, but wool in a quality that fits into the same standards for those is often more expensive than a good quality silk taffeta. But with all of these reasons, there's still one that is by far the most important to me: history. Particularly avoiding feeding into the great man theory of history that we all, well, at least in American schools, still learn. In order to do that, it's important to talk about the lives of people who are part of the crowds, a drop in the ocean of history, because even the tiniest drops can make ripples. It also allows me to talk about some of the amazing changes that occurred throughout the periods I study, be it the growth of the middle class to the many, and I mean many, peasant revolts. V introduced me to a podcast called We're Not So Different, and it has something like 4 different episodes on peasant revolts that I've been listening to while driving to SCA events. Knowing the difference between a villein and a peasant, or a peasant and a craftsman, or a craftsman and a liveried member of a guild, is massively important to studying social history, which further helps to understand the greater context of the events that you're reading about. For example, in the early 15th century in France, there is a court trial over what exactly is a peasant, as a form of regulating who could be considered the elite, which is massively important during a period when the gentry continues to grow in Europe. This context also helps you to track how things have evolved over time. For example, when studying the guilds, you can very quickly see how which guilds were wealthy or considered the most prestigious in order of precedence helped feed into mercantilism, which, as we all know, led to colonialism and capitalism, which are economic and political issues that have massively shaped our modern world and still have a huge influence on our daily life. Sure, this also has the benefit of learning about smaller dramas like the alderman John Selly, who, in the year 1382, was punished for having no lining of taffeta in his cloak by having to finance and throw a feast for his fellow aldermen and the mayor of London. When it comes to studying the lower classes and peasantry, it gets into fun things like courtship, the used clothing industry, enclosure, and of course, my favorite thing, peasant revolts. All of this to say is I greatly prefer the topics I get to study while discussing the lower to middle classes. I've got a number of scripts ready to go, and to get more in-depth about various topics from sex to the medieval concept of freedom and projects to go with them. So it begs the question, why make this dress at all? Why stray so far from my comfort zone? This Halloween, I'm dressing as the type of person who can wear silk. Sorry, not actually that. No, I've made this gown for the Scuola di Fabrizo's second tournament of defense, which this year is taking place at Newman's Castle down in Bellevue, Texas. I wanted to wear something as luxurious as the setting for the feast, but somewhat closer in period to the rapier than my usual. Thank you so much for watching. A friendly reminder to follow me on Twitter at Faye_Ls and Instagram at SterlingSeamstress. And if you like my content and would like to help me out, my Ko-fi link is in the description. I hope that those of you who might be attending the event, which has teachers like Matthew Gagney from The Modern Maker and Courtney from Opus Elenae, drop by and say hi. I should be very easy to find, even by ear.